Disclaimer for this episode, whatever you hear, this is not an episode for you to self-pathologize or diagnose. There will be some broad generalizations that are done in this episode regarding ADHD. We highly recommend that if you do feel that you are suffering from any of these symptoms, that you professionally sought out help and get the right diagnoses.
By a psychiatrist or your physician.
So this is our second episode of ADHD. In the last episode that was quite popular, we kind of went over some of the manifestations of ADHD with RSD and a lot of trauma responses that individuals wind up coping with in their older years. We also went over the lost generation of women, which I think was very important to go over with our viewers. But for today's episode, we're going to tap into a multitude of different facets and things. And I think in order to get this episode started the correct way, I'm going to pass it off to my co-host, who is going to have the actual understanding as to how this kind of affects our neurochemistry a little bit, which will give our viewers a much better understanding as to why and how certain coping mechanisms and these behaviors take place.
Thank you.
Hey, you like that?
Love that. Yeah. So I think I want to go back and kind of revisit a little bit of what we touched on with the last ADHD episode, just to go over the generalization of some of the symptoms that may manifest within this mental health disorder. So within ADHD, normally there's going to be three characteristics. So you have that lack of ability to maintain attention and focus. You're going to have that hyperactive behavior, right? Or constant physical activity. And something to note with this is in children, this is going to be a lot more overt and easily observed. So they're going to be constantly moving around. They're going to have an inability to stay in their seat, right? These are going to be all symptoms that are observable. Fidgeting, right? Whereas as we grow up and get into adulthood, this grows into a lot more of internalizing behaviors. So this is going to look a lot more like rumination, difficulty relaxing. So the inability to really be able to do slow, quiet activities. At nighttime, your mind is wandering, you're on go mode. It's difficult for you to fall asleep. It's difficult for you to even for an hour, sit still. Difficulty engaging in all of these sorts of activities, right? And that's very important to note because I think that hyperactivity sometimes can get confused because we kind of look at it as just like, oh, little boys are like running and moving around, and that's kind of how we look at it. But it could be more internalizing behavior as we age, and it tends to, right? As we get more control of our body, the prefrontal cortex starts to grow and form, and then you're going to see impulsivity. And impulsivity can be, the inability to be able to stop ourselves from speaking when someone else is. Engaging in impulse behavior such as gambling or watching pornography or binge eating or, any of these impulses, the inability to regulate our emotions. Saying something when you're angry off the rip and not giving yourself time to really think about what you're saying before you say it. And there's going to be various behavioral patterns within all of these three categories. Some of them, which we did mention last episode, but I'm just going to go over them very quickly. Difficulty finishing tasks and following through with the task. This, like I mentioned last episode, is probably one of my biggest challenges because what happens here when we get into the neuroscience of it all is you can be very excited to start a task, but to follow through with it and keep that momentum is very challenging. So oftentimes you'll see people with ADHD really want to engage in an activity or a task, be very excited to, but the second that they have to really sit down for an extended amount of time or know that it may take several days or weeks to accomplish, you'll start to see the drive dwindle down and the task is usually never completed unless there's a severe consequence, behind that. Problems listening to others. this is also something that I could attest to. Sometimes it could be really challenging when you're in a conversation with a friend, a parent, a coworker, right? And your mind is just having its own conversation and you're not even really fully actively listening to what this person is saying, because you're just so focused within your own chatter and with your brain. Struggles with organizing, tasks and responsibilities, that being able to prioritize, to plan. Forgetfulness is huge too. Always maybe losing your personal items, forgetting about a birthday, an event, being very easily distracted, constantly fidgeting, and honestly, the inability to control speech or action. So kind of like that emotional regulation. And most of the time you'll see people with ADHD, if they don't have different accommodations or modalities to help them, they'll be those people who you're mid-conversation and they're like interrupting what you're saying because they're just waiting, to say what they have to say. And they have a thought in their head and they just have to blurt it out. And it's not them trying to be rude. It's just very challenging for them to be able to wait until the person is done talking and then start to speak their thought.
I have a thought in my head.
Yeah, I was going to pause there because I just said a lot.
So I have a thought in my head, and I think that this would be good for some viewers to understand. And I said this in another podcast episode that I was actually a guest on, and it's a really good understanding and analogy of ADHD. And as a man, there's two ways that I can explain this. So what Madison was alluding to was this compulsionary and incessant need to cut people off. This impulsion and impulsive action, if you look at it, it's almost like taking a Ferrari engine and putting it into a 1990 Honda Civic with paper mache brakes. It's all gas, no brakes, and the pause button and the brake button simply just doesn't exist.
Yeah.
In regards to the task paralysis that Madison was discussing, or the intention to want to do the task that most people look at it like it's laziness, it's not. If you look at ADHD and you correlate it to erectile dysfunction, which a man suffers from, if a man has erectile dysfunction, they have the desire, they have the need and the want to perform physically and sexually with their partner, but the actual neurochemical link to allow them to perform the task is in disconnect. The same way that someone with ADHD, they want to pay attention, they want to perform, they want to organize, they want to be able to recall and process information properly, but the neural synaptic connection in order for them to do so is disconnected. So ADHD is basically like having erectile dysfunction of the brain. That is the best way to explain this. And most people have a common misconception that those with ADHD are lazy or that they're rude, for example, because they're constantly over speaking. You have to understand something. Individuals with ADHD, their brains work at a much different and higher frequency. The average person thinks about 30 to 40,000 thoughts a day. Those with ADHD think about 70,000 thoughts a day. They're constructing and deconstructing thought as quick as possible. Once a new thought comes in, one is eradicated. Once one is eradicated, a new thought comes in. And it's this vicious cycle of constantly thinking, and we call it internal chatter. Yeah. And that noise can almost be debilitating to us. So if you feel that we're trying to be rude or you feel that we're zoning out, we ourselves have our own world going on, which you just simply can't see. Right. And we're dealing with our own internal struggles of trying to pay attention to our outer world and inner world simultaneously, and it is impossible.
And I think just to piggyback off that, that's why comorbidity with ADHD is so high with depression and also anxiety. Because think about it, when you're constantly in your head and when you're on this go, 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 when you have the inability to perform at a level that your peers are, right, it could really lead to you feeling many negative emotions about yourself. You feel incompetent. You feel like you're never going to be able to thrive in a way that your typical peers can, right? So oftentimes when you're so in your head, not only does it become a conditioned response because you have this inability to be able to perform tasks at the rate as others, but also you're so on the go and in your head constantly that this can create anxiety-provoking thoughts. This could create a lot of worry, a lot of rumination. So that's another really important thing.
100%. And I definitely want to tap into this very quickly. The ADHD mind does not work on linear thinking. It does not work on conventional schooling. It does not work on traditional work models, because all of this can feel very limiting and unnatural to us. The problem is not ADHD. The problem is that society has developed this addiction to pathologize everything now in accordance with ADHD as a disorder. And in doing so, you are pigeonholing somebody into suppressing their innate flow into what makes them unique. The challenge does not derive from ADHD. The challenge derives from a broken down school system, which acts as a prison, a workflow system, which acts like a prison, and societal rigid standards, which only celebrate linearity. And the problem is when society labels brilliance and uniqueness as a disorder, this can lead to personal shame. This could lead to confusion and emotional pain. And that friction and that tension can lead to anxiety. It can lead to depression. It can lead to feelings of inadequacy. And then it can lead to feelings of isolation. And it's within those feelings of isolation that a human being will develop improper coping mechanisms. And then that's when the impulsivity kicks in, because they're looking to numb that pain.
Yeah. And I think, we talked about this last episode. The school system and how it's structured is just, even for the standard child, is very challenging, right? But we're seeing in a lot of research, and some charter schools do perform this sort of learning style, but the multisensory learning style, hands-on approach has been shown across the board to be the best for every single child to be able to learn, because not only are they participating and engaging in their learning, but they have the ability to remain focused and attentive because they're moving around, right? They're feeling things, they're touching things. So
go into multisensory. You're gonna have somebody who says, "Oh, what's multisensory?"
Yeah, so it's all of your different senses that you have. So touch, taste, feel, right? Any tactile, so that's what you could feel, that's what you could touch. So anything that you could use with your senses here, that is what is implemented in this hands-on learning. So within the general school system, they just do basically a lecture style approach, right? So the teacher's at the board, they'll be lecturing the information, child has to sit, they have to then complete the work, and so on and so forth. Whereas with this hands-on learning, they're doing experiments, they're going outside of the classroom. And I know, the regular school systems do have this, but not to the capacity that they should. So this hands-on approach should really be integrated into every single school system, because I think that it is at a disadvantage for atypical kids who really struggle, and just kids with learning disabilities or any developmental delays. And this could really help them get on the same playing field with a child who has typical functioning. So I definitely agree with everything you said too, but it's very important to note that, school systems are kind of against a lot of children in terms of learning.
I got to go off on the school system quick.
Yeah, go.
So this is something that I actually spoke about today. So society is built on uniformity. That means that school and work, they all demand that you move at one singular speed and pace and structure, at one rhythm. And the problem is, if you don't follow that rhythm, you wind up getting punished. And individuals with ADHD, they don't struggle because our minds are simply chaotic. They struggle because they're forced into environments that do not honor their own unique sense of pace, creativity, or process. And we're not living in a world that celebrates high-frequency thinkers. We celebrate linearity, normality. We celebrate those that fears what it can't control. And that's the problem. When you're in a system that makes no space for talents, for gifts, for uniqueness, that's where the actual inability to be able to perform at somebody's highest standard and place winds up coming into problem. And every single time that a student is told to sit still or focus or be normal, we're taught to reject the very thing that makes us us at the end of the day. And the truth is that most people with ADHD are not struggling because they can't focus. They're struggling because they're focused on the wrong things, in the wrong environment, under the wrong expectations. Instead of pathologizing the way that we think in school and within work, the system should be reimagining itself to include those with ADHD, because if it doesn't evolve, we then have to, and we'll build new systems eventually that will actually work for us, which is why so many people now are not going to college. Right. It's why so many of us with ADHD are finding ourselves in unique situations where we're building our own life. We're building our own structure. We're conforming to our own independence, and we're outside of the societal norms.
Yeah. And I think giving someone that flexibility and that space to be themselves and to have their own outlet is very important, because like you were saying, I mean, sometimes the norm isn't always what someone will present themselves as. Correct. Right? So, even for a typical person, it is very hard to sit for an hour on end, right? It is very hard to listen to someone for a long amount of time. Like, our brain is not actively listening for that long. Like, we need breaks, right? So to put children in a classroom and say, you have to sit here for 30, 45 minutes and listen to exactly what I'm saying without any other sensory components being used, I mean, it is really hard. So to your point, yes, I think that the system really needs to be reshaped. I think that it needs to include not only creative outlets for children to express themselves, but the flexibility for children who maybe are struggling in one area to hone in on their strengths and to be able to optimize on that, right? Because there's many different ways that people can learn, and everyone has different learning styles. So being able to differentiate between everyone's learning styles is going to benefit the class as a whole. So yes, a very big challenge is children with ADHD. I also think that it's really hard for children who struggle, because this conformity of, feeling that if this child doesn't align with what a typical child should look like, well, then we have to go to more restrictive measures. And sometimes, I'm actually bringing this one up because I've noticed this recently in my work. A lot of the times kids with ADHD are also diagnosed with ODD. And, I posed the question last week to one of my colleagues saying, is it really ODD that is manifesting, or is it the untreated ADHD and not any accommodations or strategies put in place that now the ADHD is amplified? So this emotional dysregulation is coming out stronger. That's almost looking like ODD. And this is something to really ask, because a lot of the times, it could be really easy to diagnose children with certain disorders because it looks like that, right? They're being defiant. They're having really big emotions and reactions to situations. They are, not acting like the norm. So we put a label on it. But sometimes I think that there's a lot more intervention and solutions that could be implemented before we kind of put that diagnosis, that comorbid diagnosis on some children. And a lot of the times I often see, I do like medication for certain disorders. I do think that medication for ADHD works for some, and if others don't really want it, then that's okay, because there's other things out there. However, sometimes I find that the medication is so quickly the solution, and we put all these plans in place. We have these things written up that, people should follow for strategies, for interventions. However, when there's no consistency there, and now we're just medicating the child, but we're not really seeing much improvement, well, we have to go to square one, because medication is a Band-Aid. It's not the overall solution. Medication is going to help if you have the right modalities and interventions put in place. That is never going to be, the do-all, end-all. So, I say all this to say, when I work with parents and when I I work with children who are struggling, what I try to do is do an approach where I'm kind of coaching the whole entire family, because it starts at the home and at the school system, right? You have to be just as consistent in the home than you do in the school. And I think the most frustrating part of it all is, me as a psychologist in a school, is we cannot do everything for a child struggling alone. We see them 180 days out of the year in comparison to family who has them all year round. So to have the family on board, we're not only going to see vast improvement in symptoms, but we are going to be able to lessen the stress on the parent and enable them to be equipped with tools too. So it's super important to not only the school systems to kind of jump on board to, differentiate the learning, but also the families being more open and accepting of the help and being consistent too. Because we could say we tried something once or twice at home and now it didn't work and our hands are up, and I get it. It's frustrating. It's very, it feels very challenging,
debilitating.
Thank you. I was looking for that word in my brain. Was like, it's very debilitating. I get it, to just want it to stop. I get that this can be challenging, but consistency is going to make it easier. So all I ask is, if you do have a child struggling, if you do have a child where the school is trying to help, the school is giving you feedback, but it's either being met with rejection or it's being met with inconsistency, I beg of you to please, become more equipped with some knowledge, whether that's asking the school, whether that's going on, some websites that are evidence-based, and really seeing what part you could play in it to really help your child navigate through this.
Get it, girl.
I'm sorry. I had to.
I've been dealing with. Give me some of that.
I've been dealing with a lot.
Straight facts, girl.
A lot of
Straight
this.
facts. ADHD. That's how we do it. Okay, here's the thing.
And also, can I say one more thing? Because I find this too. As a therapist, clinician, school psychologist, whatever you want to call it, you have to also understand that if parents don't know everything about a disorder, if they don't know what to do, we cannot penalize them and almost, shove it down their throat just because they're resisting at first. So I always like to, it takes two to tango. I completely agree with that. And I think the approach and how you communicate and navigate the relationship with parents is very important too, because I've had parents who were very, very, defensive and who completely shut out any sort of strategy or solution I was giving. But through building the rapport, through understanding their perspective, through learning why maybe culturally they were worried about them being put on medication, or there was maybe a stigma within their community about their child being classified or diagnosed with ADHD, I was able to not only open them up for them to feel vulnerable and speak kind of their truth, but it also allowed us to have a trusting relationship where then they were able to open the door to seek the help that originally was declined. So I always think too, it's very important to build on the rapport you have with a parent and just make sure that you get them to a place that they feel vulnerable enough to want to learn.
So
sorry,
it's okay.
I just went on a little.
It was a rant, but I like it. I dig it. The problem is I have one issue, not with what you said, but it's a word that we keep using, and it's the word disorder. And I feel like when you label somebody with a disorder like ADHD, it starts to internalize the idea that they're broken and not different and not unique, but broken. And that's truly where I believe the shame of these individuals really start to kick in. And again, this is just my own understanding of it. Like, we grow up thinking that we're the problem then because we're broken. So we try to be what everyone else wants us to be. So we try to be the overachiever, the underachiever, the people pleaser, the chameleon, and we start losing ourselves in the process and the pressure to be palatable.
Can I say something about that?
No, palpable, to be digestible, to tone down our energy, just to survive in certain schools, jobs, even relationships. It doesn't just dim our light. It's almost as if we never had one to begin with. And the ADHD doesn't create the insecurity. It's society's rejection in telling us that we have a disorder and labeling us and constantly trying to pigeonhole us that creates the insecurity. Now, again, as a coach, we come from different wheelhouses on this. So for me, the word disorder, because of the dozens of children that I have personally dealt with, we see different kids, that makes them feel so out of touch with their true innate nature that's the one thing and the one word I never try to actually label it as.
And I'm happy you brought this up because this is something that I talk about with my clients all the time with many different diagnoses that, they have or they come to find. And something that I like to talk about in therapy or in the schools when children are classified, when people are diagnosed in the clinical world, is a disorder should not be looked at as shameful, and it should not be looked at like you're the odd man out. I like to compare it to a medical illness of, if you did sprain your knee, right? If you did have ulcerative colitis, if you do have a thyroid condition. So these are all labels, right? However, the rationale behind the label isn't to degrade this person, isn't to make them feel less than, but it's just a path to help the clinician to understand what best solutions and strategies and modalities can we now implement, knowing that that's what you have. And now how can we optimize on your strengths, and looking at this disorder not as an identity, but just as a stepping stool to help with the challenges that they face and to be able to, get them to a place where they're feeling comfortable. Just like how with someone with ulcerative colitis will need their medication just to maintain that inflammation and reduce it, right? Just with someone with a hypothyroidism condition where they now need medication to produce more of that. So I really like to compare it to like medical, just because it definitely does lessen the negative perception and thoughts when I kind of word it like that.
So I validate, but I'm still going to disagree, and I will tell you why, which is fine. Okay. So for me, right, ADHD, you have colitis or a sprained knee or whatever else that you need, thyroidism,
diabetes.
Those aren't superpowers. Like, those are actual ailments, and ADHD is not a hindrance or a flaw. Colitis is a hindrance.
But it does impact and distress
people. But
it
also can create an energetic blueprint that is so powerful. Colitis and thyroidism does not do that for the individual. ADHD, when you hone it, when you learn it, when you align with it, it gives you the ability to do things that no other individual who does not have ADHD can do. So yes, I hear you. We can relate it in the diagnosis and medical terms as, an illness or something that prohibits us in certain ways that we might need medication for. Negative. That's just not how I use it. I would much rather, when I sit down with somebody, say, yes, you have ADHD. It's not a hindrance. It's not a flaw. This is a different type of energetic blueprint in your psyche that if you learn to tap into, you can use as a superpower to do so much. And it's true. The hyper focus, the ability to be empathic, the ability to see pattern recognition. Colitis ain't giving you that. Colitis is going to make you crap your pants. Like, it's not giving you any talents at the end of the day.
No, I understand that. But also you have to understand, in the lens that I work in as a psychologist, if a child's classified in the school, like, they have to have that diagnosis. If someone is diagnosed in the clinical world, they have to have
and
that
all of
diagnosis.
my clients have to have the diagnosis.
Right, just
I understand.
to be able
Correct.
to
and I understand
obtain
that.
treatment. So for me, I understand, and it makes sense with, your coaching that, of course, you're going to talk about how it shouldn't be labeled as a disorder. And I completely appreciate that. And I think that that's amazing. But for me, when I have to tell someone that this is the diagnosis or this is the classification, well, I kind of get the brunt of,
oh, I know that.
Now, what am I supposed to do? I'm scared. I'm nervous. Or if we see the difficulties and the challenges that, I think this kid may have ADHD. I think we need to look a little bit further. And then the parent is rejecting, that testing and evaluation. Well, now I have to sit back and give these almost not justifications, but I have to kind of make them feel comfortable and really destigmatize it to be able to open the door for them to feel comfortable to get that
How
evaluation.
often? Because I see it so often on a weekly basis that I get a new client and at least one of the parents, and for some reason it's usually the father, who does not believe in ADHD, that says, my kid doesn't have it. It's all in his head. It's all made up. It's not real. He's the problem. He's hyper. He just can't focus. Back in my day, you know, this didn't exist and no one had ADHD. And bro, you're wrong. Because yes, you did. Yes, people in your generation did. And in my opinion, that's one of the biggest forms of subconscious parental abuse, neglecting the needs of your child and diminishing them when they're actually struggling and not seeing them for what they're actually going through. And just because you can't see that your child has his own unique, authentic identity and you're trying to push your nonsense onto him because of your core beliefs, shame on you.
So this is really,
not sorry. You know, not sorry.
No, this is a very hard and frustrating situation that I think I deal with the most, and I think everyone around me does who's in my field.
Is it more mothers or fathers that you see?
It could be both. And listen, I have some parents who are completely on board from the jump. They,
so do I. I understand that.
They don't feel,
they'll do whatever
they want to do whatever
they need to do in order to benefit the child.
And let me just say this too: the parents who are resistant, the parents who do have some opinion on it, negative opinion, they do want to help their child. I just think, you know, there's a lot that goes into it. So one, it could be cultural, which I've dealt with before.
Oh my God, yeah.
You know, another one could be a stigma on just, you know, generational stigma of mental health. I've seen that. Other ones could be, you know, more of this conditioned response where this parent is more of that, you know, toughen up. You got to pick yourself up by your bootstraps and let's go. And another part that I've seen too is the parents don't want to take on this perceived embarrassment that they may have within their community if their child does have ADHD or is classified within the school system and that needs like some extra help. So it could be really hard to navigate a situation like this because you really try to work with them and everyone else is seeing the challenges that this child is dealing with, and everyone else is seeing that there needs to be a further intervention. There needs to be, you know, whether that be behavioral modifications, whether that be medicational management, something, but it does get to a point where it's exhausting for everyone else and almost not fair because if we're all doing our best on our end to try to help the situation, but we're not getting that on the parental side, it's sad and it's very unfair, not to me or not to the teachers or not to anyone else,
it's
to the child.
It's unfair to the child who's struggling and who genuinely needs the help more than anything.
And think about a child with ADHD who's very hyperactive, who's constantly getting in trouble, who's having such a hard time making friends and having peer rejection due to their social skills, right? How do you think it is for them? Now they have this perceived notion that something's wrong with them. They're being rejected in this classroom by their peers. So it's doing more harm than good, kind of putting your child in this situation. And despite how you feel, and you could be against mental health, you could be against medication, you could be against, you know, classifying your child within the school system. But at the end of the day, this is not about you and your opinion. It's about your child and what they need. So I would always stress to parents, please, I get that you feel a type of way and we could work through this. I could help you out with it. I can coach you in ways of being able to manage it and process it, because I understand like having a child and, you know, possibly finding out that they need extra support. It can be emotionally draining, and it can really lead to a lot of feelings that come up that, you know, embarrassment, shame, guilt, possibly feeling like it's you. But ultimately, if they need help, they need help. Please do not put, you know, them through more than it needs. They have to.
Don't imprint your nonsense on your child because you are too silly to see that there's actually something wrong. I do have a question.
Yes.
Because we're talking a lot about kids.
Yeah,
now.
we are.
And I don't want to fixate on kids.
No,
I want to go more into also the adults with ADHD.
And I want to go into a little bit of the neuroscience of it so we could
So
touch on
this is what I want to do. I want to go into the neuroscience, which I want you to do right now, okay? And then I really want to get into how that child that was left undiagnosed, okay, winds up manifesting those insecurities as an adult.
Okay.
And what winds up happening from the neurochemistry as a teenager and as an adult. Because let's be real, 5-year-olds ain't listening to us. Okay.
No, in
7
general,
or 10.
no.
I get it.
Right.
We need to get the message across that if you are somebody in your 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, right now, this part of the podcast is for you.
Yes. Okay. So recently there was this study done in 2015, and it was the low dopamine hypothesis. And basically what this study suggests is that individuals with ADHD have dysfunction in the brain's dopaminergic system, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, which contributes to symptoms like the inattention, the impulsivity, and poor emotional regulation, right? So inability to plan, inability to organize, inability to remain focused, right? And then there is this part of the brain in the basal ganglia that is also impacted by this. So, and I won't get into all the jargon with that, but so going back to the basics, what is dopamine, right? So dopamine is a neurotransmitter that plays a crucial role in motivation, in focus, in reward processing. However, in individuals with ADHD, this dopamine system doesn't function as efficiently as it does in neurotypical individuals, right? So while some people with ADHD may have lower dopamine levels, I find a lot of people think it's just about lower dopamine levels, but what they found is actually there may be an issue more about how the brain regulates and utilizes dopamine. So this is more of a dysregulation and not like a dopamine deficiency,
because
right?
deficiency means that something is not there.
Right.
That's the thing.
Exactly. So a lot of people, I think, will correlate the dopamine in ADHD or even, depression or honestly, any disorder with deficiency. However, it's not really about deficiency. It's about dysregulation and the inability for, dopamine to work in the way that it's intended to. So this is about how dopamine is released, recycled, and processed. So it's the dopaminergic circuitry, right? So what they really found with this is that most of the times with people with ADHD, if they have an inability to release, recycle, and process their dopamine at a rate that functions, at the speed of a typical person, what's going to happen and what they found is a lot of the times people with ADHD have really quick releases of dopamine into their brain where they need it. So the prefrontal cortex, the basal ganglia. However, they have a very quick then drop of the dopamine. So for not normal people, I'm sorry, I don't like to use that word. For neurotypical people, they'll have a dopamine release. It'll stay in that prefrontal cortex for a little bit. So that's giving you that motivation. That's giving you that attention, right? And then it'll release slowly. However, there is a very quick drop of dopamine in people with ADHD. Now, what the hell does that mean? Well, that means that individuals with ADHD have higher sensitivity to rewards, right? So they do not get they get more of a blunted response to delayed rewards. So they don't really get excited for long-term gratification. They have a heightened drive for immediate gratification, right? So this could look like now impulsive behavior. So this is now where we get into the impulsivity and the need to have that instant kind of reward. So that could look like spending. That could look like substance use. That could look like overeating, right? So all of these, when you see that the dopamine only lasts a lot shorter, it's released quicker and removed quicker. Well, then that means that the dopamine isn't staying in your system long enough to really elicit any sort of response that would warrant you staying on a long-term task or understanding what a long-term reward could do. So in turn, people with ADHD really like short-term rewards because the dopamine is only there for a little bit. So norepinephrine also is involved with this, and serotonin, and these more affect like your emotional control. And then norepinephrine is really helps with alertness and regulating stress, but it's often deficient in people with ADHD. So that could explain more of the irritability, poor focus, and being easily overwhelmed. Whereas serotonin, which I'm sure many people have heard of before, that plays a role more in your mood and emotional balance. Yep. And ADHD brains also show an insufficient serotonin signaling. So again, that release and recycle, right? And this could contribute to mood swings or anxiety. So with people with ADHD, the system isn't resetting as quickly after these emotional triggers. So this will make people feel stuck in their emotions because serotonin has this insufficient signaling where it takes longer to really process all of this. So with all of that being said, one more thing I want to kind of tap into with this science is we have two functions within our brain, which is the default mode network, and then we also have task positive network. So DMN or TPN. So the default network is exactly kind of how it sounds. It's your default. It's when you're kind of chilling. It's when you're not focused on anything, right? So this is when you're maybe thinking, you're mind wandering, you're ruminating, you're relaxed, you're daydreaming, resting. This is that mode, right? And then for our task network, what we have is this is when you're engaged in a task, especially one that requires attention. So maybe a report, maybe during work, you're in a meeting. So this is going to be more attention focused. Working memory is going to be active here. Problem solving is going to be active. So these two functions actually work as like a seesaw in our brain. And in a neurotypical brain, these networks are going to alternate. So I say the example of, let's say you're at work, right? It's 11 o'clock. You have an hour to complete maybe a report. So your TPN, your task network, is going to be more active at this time, while your default mode is going to be more inactive because you have to focus right now. You have those vision goggles. You have to get this report done. But now it's 12 o'clock and you're going on lunch. So now, like a seesaw, your default is going to increase the functionality while your task network is going to decrease because now you don't really have anything to focus on. You're just eating lunch, you're chilling, you're not in this attention space. So what they say is with people with ADHD, this kind of alternation there's a malfunction there. So the switch they find doesn't go on like it should. So people with ADHD, oftentimes they're in default activity when they really should be in task mode. So even when they're trying to focus, their brain is more in that default mode than it is in that task mode. And the default mode does not shut off properly during tasks. So this will lead to daydreaming while you're working, right? Or zoning out. This will lead to the inability to stay focused. It'll have you internally distracted. So maybe racing thoughts, worries, and, all of this, why all this matters is it kind of shows that sustained attention is much harder for people with ADHD, right? And emotional regulation and self-talk now is going to get upticked because in your default mode, that's where you ruminate. That's where you think. That's where you're kind of in your head, positively, or it could turn negatively. And we'll kind of talk about that. So if your brain regions, involved in this rumination and self-criticism are constantly heightened, this is going to amplify something like we've talked about, rejection sensitivity, right? Or emotional flooding of thoughts. And since the focus is only on kind of being in your own head, well, now this is going to lead to a lot of other challenges. So I think that that's like,
yeah, that's
did that all, I know that was a lot, and I was trying to kind of say it in a way that's not jargony.
It went. And I think this is there's two things I want to touch on. One is something you said about ADHD being a regulation issue,
yes,
not a deficit issue.
No.
And it's not just a regulation issue within the neurochemicals. It's not just the dopamine, norepinephrine, or your serotonin, or even your cortisol. It's not about the recycling and the flooding. There is so much more that entails with ADHD of a regulation. You have your neurochemical regulation. You have your nervous system regulation. You have circadian rhythm regulation. You have all different types of processing regulation. So this entire ADHD component structure all stems down to one giant regulatory dysfunction. Not that it's a deficit. Inclusive to something that you just said, which again, I want to tap into for this episode. Again, you said something about the rejection sensitivity. It's important to tap on this. For those of you who are unaware, what rejection sensitivity dysphoria is, if you are somebody as a child who went through multiple microcorrections, multiple criticisms, the slightest nuanced external hit of a eye movement, rejection, criticism, correction, body language, tonality can feel like an absolute dagger to the heart that is taken out and then stuck inside of you again. Rejection sensitivity dysphoria is a traumatic response to growing up, feeling unseen, feeling unheard, feeling rejected, feeling isolated, feeling left out, feeling like you don't fit in, being corrected, being criticized too much. And as you get older, it manifests into a physical debilitation of pain.
Can I add something really quickly?
Of course.
Also, not only could it become a conditioned response to rejection, but also within our brain chemistry for people with ADHD, your prefrontal cortex is underactive. So with your planning and your logical reasoning, while your amygdala, which is your emotional response system, is hyperactive. So this is where you see a lot of people with ADHD will react more based off that emotional response as opposed to that logical reasoning. So that impulsivity of feelings, that RSD, that perceived notion of rejection is going to be stronger also because of those systems that are under or overactive.
And it's also a perceived notion of danger because when you go through that amygdala hijack, what's happening is that you go into that fight, flight, or freeze when your amygdala gets hijacked and your prefrontal cortex literally shuts off.
Right. And you don't know if you don't feel safe. So it's a physiological response. Like we've all had it. Our ancestors had this, right? And there's something else I want to note really quickly where I found very interesting. I was listening to something and they were saying that, impulsivity would have been a survival trait in a different world context, right? So back in the day when we were nomads and we had to search for food or we had to, go fight to find land, impulsivity was a strength. You needed to be able to not think too fast and not kind of dwell on, different kind of thoughts. So impulsivity was such a strength in other, contexts. However, now when we have everything at the palm of our hands, impulsivity now can be deemed as more of, a challenge sort of behavior due to that. But I just wanted to add that in really quickly because I found that interesting.
And that's super important because, again, different times, different eras.
Exactly.
Different reasonings why physiological responses would serve time, place. The whole point of your fight, flight, and freeze mode network when your body goes into that state is because of an external source of danger. Now what's happening is when you have RSD, you're feeling a sense of familiarity, of danger because of a trauma response from all these pent up years of rejection and criticism and corrections. And you literally start to trick yourself that you are in danger, and it is now manifesting at a physiological level to the point where you feel pain. And that is also then why RSD, people will want to numb the contortions of dealing with that kind of pain.
And I think that's a really good point that you just made in terms of numbing, because, you know, the whole point of RSD and, you know, for people to really understand is people really do feel this high sense of rejection and criticism. And with the amygdala being overactivated, with the prefrontal cortex being dysregulated, there's going to be emotional flooding when there's any perceived notion of rejection, criticism, being an outcast. And on top of it, there's going to be difficulty, you know, putting criticism into perspective. And oftentimes this does happen with children, and when they are at school and when they are with their peers and, you know, with their teachers, like I've said earlier, bringing it back to the children is children oftentimes feel like an outcast in school with this diagnosis, or when ADHD goes untreated most of the time, because they don't really understand what's wrong with them, and all they know is they're very hyperactive, but they keep getting scolded for it. They are impulsive and keep like interjecting in their friends' conversations, but they're being met with, you know, side eyes, or they're being met with harsh words, and kids not really wanting to be around them. And it's really difficult for these children to navigate their everyday knowing that, you know, I don't feel like I fit in. I feel like I'm a burden, or I feel bothered. And this can become a very conditioned response, especially, and I'll emphasize this again, if it goes untreated as an adult. And I think that this manifests in so many different areas of life as an adult, whether that be addiction, whether that be relational problems. And, you know, when we talk about that next episode, because I think what we're going to do is we're going to make this a 3-part series. And today we were going to try to get into adults, but I think that focusing on the kids for this episode, and then next episode, we're going to talk about adults with ADHD, addiction, and relationships, and how those kind of intertwine together. And then, you know, the third part, modalities and interventions for not only adults, but also for children. And I'll kind of be going through, I think, in part 3, my experience as a school psychologist, because mainly if you are a parent, you're going to be working with the school psychologist, you know, through all of this. If you do get this diagnosis and your child is struggling within the school setting, that's kind of very much my forte and my wheelhouse. So I think I'm going to be talking a lot about different interventions and modalities and supports and how to navigate through all of that if you do find your child struggling, or if they are right now. And I think, you know, that it'll be great. But the 3-part series is going to give us enough time to really talk about everything and really deep dive with information that we want to let all of you know. So
100%. And you know what? I want to have one key takeaway from this, that the whole ADHD construct is not just about the cognitive issues that these young adults, children, and older adults face. It's not just about the executive function deficits in the cognitive issues. It's also about the existential crisis that these kids face of not fitting in, not belonging, feeling unseen, feeling rejected. And if we just look to attack ADHD from an executive function deficit side, you're never actually going to get to the root and the crux of the issue, which is really tapping into the psyche and the ingrained etching that they feel from external sources of being left out, of not being validated, of not being seen, of not feeling like they fit in.
And a lot of times too, I'll add that children who do have ADHD sometimes have a learning disability,
100%.
right? And we're not sure yet in the literature if it's like a true learning disability, or if it's a learning disability due to them being inattentive and hyperactive. So they're not like focusing and having an ability to retain the information. So the correlation isn't completely known yet. But, you know, if you have a learning disability on top of ADHD, well, now how do you think the child's feeling? You know, they're feeling like a failure. They're feeling like they're never going to amount to anything or understand. And I know that sounds harsh, but these are really true feelings and emotions and thoughts that these children face.
And let me say this, just so there's some clarification and discernment. Not every individual with ADHD has a learning disorder either. There are there are so many cases of individuals with ADHD that are so hyper intelligent.
Oh yeah,
insanely
for sure.
hyper intelligent. It's just the different speed and the different frequencies that the brain is retaining, processing, and creating information at.
Right.
So there's a lot of different literature that depicts different things. In all honesty, I don't know what the actual evidence is to show that ADHD links directly to learning disabilities. It may not. It may
it's
be
a
a
small
little bit more
amount.
prominent.
I just felt like it was worth noting that
is definitely worth
there
noting.
is a portion that does have learning disabilities along.
But you're also such a genius too.
Yeah,
Don't
but then
forget
some
that.
don't at all. But I'm talking more about the children who are
100%.
struggling, and you know, if the parents are seeing this too, seeking help and treatment and, you know, other modalities that we'll talk about in other episodes is imperative, because this will then help with that perceived notion that, you know, they aren't good enough, and maybe hopefully they could build that confidence and self-awareness with some strategies and interventions.
So next episode, we're going to go over as to how ADHD, how it manifests in relationships and in your relationship with yourself, which could cause addictions. And then after that, we're going to see how it plays out. But ultimately, our end goal is to get into another episode where we go over the modalities, the techniques, the tangible tools, implementations. You guys are lucky enough to have an actual school psychologist and a coach that attack things from very different angles.
Yeah.
And I think you will get a slew and a plethora of different ideas and modalities that forever who is listening with kids or for themselves, you will be able to get an insane amount of knowledge and tools that you will be able to utilize on your own.
Yeah. And also, disclaimer, you know, any interventions, modalities we do talk about, or any maybe symptoms that you feel like are relatable, please do not self-diagnose. If you're curious about anything that we mention, or if it seems relatable, then really go to your psychiatrist or physician to kind of bring awareness to, you know, some of the symptoms you're experiencing, for them to do a comprehensive evaluation. So I don't want this to be, you know, something where we're diagnosing
100%.
ourselves with. But yeah, I'm excited.
See ya.